Opening the center immediately creates dynamic possibilities and invites aggressive play. Embracing asymmetrical challenges, black immediately stakes a claim in the center, fostering dynamic counterplay instead of mirroring white's pawn. Securing the center and preparing d4, this knight adds pressure to the d5 square. Developing this knight solidifies the center and prepares for potential pawn advances, creating a balanced early game. This bishop immediately pressures black's center, creating potential for future tactical exchanges and influencing the pawn structure. The knight's bold thrust disrupts white's bishop pair, creating immediate tactical possibilities and forcing a defensive reaction. Developing the knight to f3 now safeguards the e4 pawn while preparing for kingside castling, aiming for a solid position. Sacrificing a knight for positional pressure, black opens lines but concedes significant pawn structure weaknesses. Recapturing the knight opens lines, forcing a strategic assessment of piece activity and pawn structure dynamics. Challenging white's knight and initiating pawn engagement, this aggressive thrust aims to disrupt the opponent's development and gain crucial queenside territory. Re-establishing the knight on its ideal outpost on c3, this repositioning prepares for a potential advance of the d-pawn and aims to control key central squares, subtly influencing the pawn structure's solidity. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to develop the king's bishop, d6 aims to create a more robust central presence and opens up diagonals for future piece activity. Initiating pawn storm on the queenside now challenges black's central control, aiming to unravel their pawn structure and gain initiative. Exchanging pawns here releases the central tension, inviting a more open game where piece activity and pawn structure will become paramount. Black's decision to capture opens the c-file for potential action and simplifies the immediate landscape, forcing both sides to reevaluate their pawn chains and control of key squares. Reclaiming the pawn opens a central highway for your queen, aiming to dominate the d-file and potentially pressure black's kingside. Developing the knight to f6 not only brings it into the fray, but also cleverly creates a threat against white's queen, forcing a response and potentially disrupting their immediate plans. Challenging black's development directly, this bishop advance aims to disrupt the coordination of black's knights and potentially create weaknesses around the kingside, all while setting the stage for a battle for central control and piece activity in the ensuing complications. Probing the bishop's position with an aggressive pawn thrust, black initiates a tactical dance designed to disrupt white's bishop pair and potentially gain material if white miscalculates the ensuing pawn structure. Shifting the bishop to the wing allows for a potential regrouping, aiming to challenge black's central pawn structure and perhaps prepare a kingside attack. This pawn thrust drastically opens the kingside, exposing your monarch to immediate threats and weakening the dark squares around it. Be prepared for a swift counterattack as white's bishop on h4 now has a clearer diagonal. Retreating the bishop to g3 skillfully shores up the e4 pawn, while also preparing to potentially reroute the bishop to a more active diagonal should the opportunity arise, perhaps targeting the d6 pawn or even aiming towards the kingside if black missteps. This daring pawn thrust immediately injects dynamic energy, seeking to unravel the center and disrupt white's comfortable development by seizing vital central squares. Initiating a swift repositioning of the queen, white seeks to escape the immediate pin and re-establish central influence, all while preparing for potential pawn pushes on the queenside to gain space. Developing the bishop to a square where it activates its diagonal influence and eyes the enemy kingside creates a dynamic central tension, preparing for potential pawn storms or piece sacrifices aimed at disrupting white's centralized queen. Securing the king behind a castled position often unlocks previously constrained pieces, and in this instance, castling queenside immediately challenges black's central control by opening the d-file for the white rook. Unleashing the queen toward white's queenside, this maneuver immediately challenges the bishop and knight pairing, forcing a response and potentially disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn structure. The intent here is likely to exploit the diagonal, creating future attacking possibilities and seeking to untangle black's somewhat cramped position, while simultaneously eyeing the weakened dark squares around white's monarch. Pawns advance on the queen side, a strategic gambit aiming to disrupt black's attacking potential before it fully materializes, while subtly preparing for potential pawn advances later. Securing the open c-file with the rook signals a potent counteroffensive, threatening to infiltrate white's queen side and disrupt the castled king's safety. Unlocking the d-file's potential hinges on this timely centralization of the rook, aiming to bolster the queenside pressure and potentially eye the c-file if black isn't vigilant. The bishop's journey to e7 aims to reinforce the kingside pawn structure and prepare for the d-pawn's advance, potentially solidifying black's central presence while simultaneously developing a previously passive piece to a more active square. Shifting the knight to d2 conserves the central presence while preparing to redeploy it to a more active square, perhaps c4 or even b3, to exert influence on the queenside or support a potential kingside expansion. Black's pawn thrust on the queenside, b5, aggressively challenges white's queenside majority and aims to disrupt the harmony of white's pieces, particularly the knight on c3, while simultaneously opening lines for potential counterplay. The monarch seeks a more secure haven, shifting the king away from the open d-file and potential bishop pressure along the diagonal. Challenging the queenside pawn structure, black injects immediate dynamism, seeking to unravel white's advanced king and disrupt its cozy setup by creating an attacking avenue. Opening the file immediately offers a direct assault on black's queenside pawn structure, aiming to exploit the resulting weaknesses and gain active piece play while simultaneously disrupting black's intended queenside expansion. Unlocking the queenside is the immediate objective here, as the queen swings into a more active position, eyeing the now exposed pawn structure. Stepping forward with the knight to d5 immediately challenges black's queen and creates a central stronghold, potentially aiming to disrupt the pawn structure on the queenside if black isn't careful with their response. The knight sacrifices its life to disrupt white's central pawn structure and open lines toward the king. This exchange, while seemingly giving up material, aims to inject chaos and force white into defensive calculations rather than aggressive planning. It's a bold bid for initiative, betting that the subsequent positional advantages will outweigh the lost knight. Unleashing an open file and a powerful pawn chain, white decisively aims to exploit the central tension and gain a significant space advantage. Consolidating the bishop on d7 shores up the queenside and prepares for future queenside expansion, while also potentially eyeing the c6 square if the knight ventures there. Solidifying the pawn structure around the king becomes paramount now, preventing black's active pieces, particularly the queen and bishop on e7, from exploiting the central weakness created by the earlier pawn advances. Seizing the open file offers significant attacking prospects, potentially pressuring the king's defenses on the queen side, while simultaneously creating a mobile battery with the queen. The pawn advanced to b3, while seeming innocuous, subtly aims to reinforce the queen's bishop on c1 and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, though it does concede a slight structural weakness on the c3 square. Black finally seizes the initiative, castling to safety and preparing to contest the crucial open d-file. This maneuver reroutes the rook to a more active position, aiming to pressure the b-pawn and potentially open the e-file for future operations, while simultaneously creating a defensive screen for the king and supporting the knight's advanced outpost. Rethinking the queenside blockade, black shifts the queen to b7, a more flexible square that avoids immediate confrontation and prepares to potentially challenge the d5 pawn's dominion. Launching an assault on the kingside, this aggressive pawn push aims to rip open lines for white's pieces, particularly targeting black's castled monarch. Consider the geometric implications of the resulting pawn structure. If black accepts the challenge, the king's shield might crumble, creating pathways for the queen and rooks to penetrate. Alternatively, a passive response could leave white with a dangerous initiative and control of crucial squares. Asserting central influence, this maneuver directly challenges white's queen and forces a decision regarding the e-pawn's fate, simultaneously preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop to an active diagonal and potentially pinning the queen or creating counterplay on the queen side. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, white opens lines with a daring pawn sacrifice, seeking to expose black's monarch. The immediate danger isn't necessarily a checkmate, but rather the creation of long-term structural weaknesses around the black king that can be exploited later. White is essentially gambling that the disruption caused by this pawn push will outweigh the material deficit, or that black will misstep in defending the now open diagonals. This is a bold, aggressive move that demands precise calculation from both sides. The question is whether black can consolidate and repel the attack, or if white's initiative will prove overwhelming. Opening that diagonal for the queen and rook offers immediate counterplay along the now open g-file, forcing white to defend their monarch from potential threats, while simultaneously creating a less-than-ideal pawn structure on the king side. Asserting control over the central squares, this knight repositioning aims to disrupt black's burgeoning queenside pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened light squares around the enemy king. Probing the rook's activity on the open file, this move seeks to disrupt white's king's safety and establish a more commanding presence along the c-file, potentially creating threats against the isolated pawn or opening lines for further pressure. Shifting the knight to the queen side aims to disrupt black's pawn structure, potentially creating weaknesses on the c-file or the queen side in general, and preparing for a more active role in the upcoming middle game struggle, even if it means temporarily ceding some central influence. This maneuver actively challenges white's initiative by directly contesting the center and preparing to exploit the now open g-file for potential counterplay against the uncastled king. Unleashing a rook onto the open king file, white aims to exploit the exposed nature of black's monarch, creating immediate pressure and threatening to dismantle the defender's structure. Initiating pawn storms often comes with positional risks, and this advance to the 5th rank may overextend your queenside pawns, potentially creating weaknesses that could be exploited later in the game if white manages to consolidate. Reinforcing the diagonal provides a crucial outpost for the bishop, preparing to challenge black's queenside initiative and solidify white's pawn structure. Opening a dangerous diagonal for the queen and aiming to shatter the pawn shield in front of white's king. Unlocking the queenside pawn chain with this advance introduces dynamic imbalance, forcing a decision on whether to embrace the subsequent tactical skirmish or find a more defensive setup. Preparing to wrestle control of the kingside shadows, this maneuver aims to activate the monarch, shifting it away from the perilous central files and potential discover attacks lurking on the diagonal. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside aims to rupture black's defenses, but risks weakening white's own monarch. Shifting the queen to this square feels like a hopeful, yet perhaps premature, attempt to disrupt white's looming pawn storm by offering a direct challenge, but it leaves the kingside potentially exposed to further advances. Shifting the queen to e2 reestablishes a defensive posture, safeguarding the king and preparing to potentially reroute the queen towards the kingside should an opportunity arise, while also offering support to the e-pawn if black decides to advance it further. Unleashing the rook onto the open file, black aims to create immediate threats against white's king and disrupt its sheltered position. Exchanging the rooks on the h-file removes a potent attacker and simplifies the position, potentially easing black's defensive burden and opening up white's king further, but it also concedes control of the open file. Reclaiming the central file with the rook immediately solidifies black's presence and prepares to challenge white's king, which currently enjoys a seemingly safe haven behind pawns. But that illusion is about to be shattered by the open highway the rook now commands. Sharpening the rook's offensive reach, this maneuver aims to exploit the open file and pressure black's somewhat exposed kingside pawn structure. Intensifying the pressure on the queen side, this move cleverly utilizes the open queenside file while simultaneously offering a tactical escape route for the queen, aiming to complicate white's central control and potentially create attacking chances down the b-file. Solidifying the king's safety by tucking it away on the b-file is a sensible, albeit somewhat passive, defensive maneuver in this complex, unbalanced position, aiming to evade any immediate threats on the open central files and prepare for potential pawn pushes later. Unleashing a final desperate flourish, this check forces the white king into a more exposed position, aiming to disrupt white's carefully constructed defensive setup and potentially open lines for further attack. The king retreats to safety, prioritizing its personal security above all else, as the queenside pawns are now completely immobilized. A courageous choice to throw your rook into the fray, aiming to destabilize the white king's sanctuary on the queenside, though it invites a potentially sharp counterplay along the c-file. Sharpening the pressure on the queenside, this move is about activating your queen for a potential raid, eyeing squares like b3 to support a pawn push or reposition for a more central role, while also ensuring your king is not immediately vulnerable after black's last aggressive thrust. The rook now vacates the c-file, offering a potential outpost for white's knight on c4. But more importantly, it begins repositioning for activity on the queenside, aiming to exploit the weak b-pawn and perhaps even pressure white's king once the queenside pawns are cleared. Stepping into the opponent's territory, the rook on c6 brazenly challenges the entire queenside structure, aiming to disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially create weaknesses on the b-file. Seeking to untangle the congested queenside, black maneuvers the queen to the only square offering respite, preparing to contest the open c-file with the rook that will soon join the fray. This surprising maneuver by the queen seeks to exploit the potential weakness of the back rank and the pinned rook on the b-file, aiming to create immediate chaos and pressure. The black queen's repositioning aims to exploit the open c-file, creating potential threats against white's monarch and potentially disrupting the harmony of his pieces. Activating the bishop to c3 offers a dual purpose, reinforcing the d4 pawn and preparing for potential future pawn pushes on the king side. Shifting the bishop to f6 creates an immediate threat of forking the queen and rook on the c-file, forcing white to react defensively and potentially disrupt their pawn structure. Ra6 jolts the position awake by unleashing the rook from its passive defensive post and immediately challenging black's pawn chain and control of the queenside. This aggressive repositioning aims to disrupt black's coordination and exploit any overextension, potentially creating tactical opportunities on the 7th rank or forcing concessions. Unleashing the queen to this central square offers an immediate counterpressure against white's rook, probing for weaknesses and preparing potential forks or discoveries if white's king feels any less secure. Bringing the queen to the 6th rank decisively targets the uncastled king and the vulnerable pawns on the queenside, creating immediate attacking prospects. Breaking the blockade with a pawn thrust, black aims to pry open lines for his queen and rook, forcing a dynamic confrontation in the center, though it risks weakening his already exposed king. Sacrificing material to open a line for the queen and attack the opponent's exposed king, aiming for a swift checkmate. The queen is out of immediate danger, but the price paid is a significant concession in central pawn presence, leaving the d6 square open to white's potentially powerful advanced pieces. The recapture of the bishop solidifies white's material advantage and aims to exploit the now open d-file for potential pressure against black's king. Liberating the f-pawn now exposes the king to a potential cascade of checks along the now open diagonal, though the immediate capture threat on the d-pawn offers a temporary reprieve. Stealing the initiative, white establishes a commanding presence on the c-file, aiming to sever black's queenside connections and force concessions. Sacrificing the pawn with the intent to create a passed pawn offers a dynamic contrast to the previous exchanges, shifting the focus to white's potentially exposed king and the pawn's march toward promotion. Unleashing the pawn's final push, this advance seeks to disrupt black's entrenched pieces and create a passed pawn, potentially overwhelming the defense. Unleashing the bishop here to contest the crucial central diagonal presents a dynamic shift, aiming to disrupt white's pawn chain and potentially expose weaknesses in the king's defenses as the material evaporates. Unveiling the bishop to c3 is a strategic attempt to finally unpin the knight and force a reckoning in the center, potentially leading to a breakthrough or creating opportunities for your rooks. Recapturing with the bishop not only removes a dangerous attacking piece from white's repertoire, but also opens up a potential diagonal for black's queen, hinting at a shift towards endgame maneuvering where piece activity will reign supreme. The rooks now dominate the open files, turning this into a stark battle for control of central territory as the pawn structure crumbles. Seeking to exploit the open d-file and target white's isolated pawn, black brings the rook into the fray, aiming for a more active position in a simplified endgame. Securing the d-file with the rook now offers a direct path to the enemy king's remaining defenses, while simultaneously preventing any sneaky counterplay black might attempt on the queen side. Behold the bishop's bold repositioning, a strategic retreat from the open file that seeks to anchor itself on a more influential diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pawn structure and potentially set up a future kingside attack or defend against white's persistent pawn push. Asserting dominance on the open c-file now becomes paramount, aiming to dislodge black's well-defended bishop and disrupt any lingering counterplay. Disengaging the bishop from the dangerous diagonal is a wise strategic retreat, allowing it to find more secure squares and prepare for future action, while also safeguarding the pawn structure from immediate threats. The knight's repositioning seeks to activate it on the queen side, potentially pressuring pawns or participating in a discovered attack. Finally, the long-awaited promotion injects a new queen onto the board, dramatically shifting the material balance and opening fresh tactical possibilities for black. Repositioning the knight to **e3*** seeks to bolster the king's defense and potentially prepare a more active role for the knight in the ensuing endgame, perhaps targeting key squares or supporting a pawn advance should opportunities arise. The newly crowned queen, after navigating a complex battlefield, immediately seeks to assert her presence on the second rank, aiming to support the beleaguered pawns and potentially harass white's weakened king. Unleashing a forcing check, this knight leap seeks to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially expose the king, aiming to capitalize on the discovered attack possibilities that arise if the king moves. Unleashing the king from its pawn shield creates immediate dangers, but also offers a desperate chance for counterplay amidst the collapsing position. The rook's relocation to the fifth rank aggressively pins down the passed pawn and threatens a quick checkmate on the king's current diagonal, creating immediate tactical headaches for black. The king's newfound central freedom offers immediate attacking chances, forcing the opponent to choose between immediate concessions or prolonged defensive struggles. Unleashing a bold counterattack on the queen side, white aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and create dynamic counterplay before the enemy king can fully consolidate. Challenging the king's new residence in the corner with an immediate check forces white to either move their monarch again or enter a less favorable pawn structure. White's king bravely steps into the fray, a calculated gamble to disrupt black's pawn promotion while initiating a desperate but potentially decisive counterattack against the exposed queen. A desperate gamble is made as the black queen ventures deep into enemy territory, seeking a spark of counterplay amidst a crumbling defense. The rook repositions, eyeing the seventh rank to potentially disrupt black's pawn structure or create mating threats on the queen side, a classic endgame maneuver to apply pressure without immediate commitment. Unleashing a final, desperate check, black forces the white king into a precarious exposed position, offering a fleeting moment of tactical chaos in an otherwise determinedly fading contest. Unveiling the king's hidden vulnerabilities, this placement initiates a perilous chase across open terrain, forcing black's queen into an active, albeit exposed, position where it becomes a prime target for devastating sacrifices. The queen's foray, forcing the king into an even more exposed position, opens up a potent battery along the now critical file, hinting at a swift conclusion through coordinated attacks. Relocating the monarch to a safer square, seeking refuge from the immediate checks and preserving king activity for a potential counterplay. The rook's maneuver to e8 finally activates its defensive potential, shoring up the back rank and preparing to contest the open file, a crucial piece of defensive coordination in this complex endgame. Seizing the central open file now allows white to potentially disrupt black's pawn structure and pressure the king's remaining defenders. This retreat offers white a chance to activate their rook on the 7th rank and pressure the weaker pawn, forcing black to defend it and potentially allowing white to regroup and prepare for a decisive central advance or an attack on the king side. This knight's journey to d4 offers a fresh perspective, aiming to disrupt black's queenside control and potentially exploit the newly created space. Unleashing a desperate final assault, black's king finds itself teetering on the precipice of disaster, forced to expose its vulnerable flank with this aggressive thrust. Disengaging the king from the central fray offers a safer haven, preparing to potentially shepherd the remaining pawns. Shifting the queen to the king side, black aims to stir up trouble for white's isolated king and potentially create new attacking possibilities by offering a queen trade or initiating a queenside pawn push. The monarch scurries from the incoming onslaught, a desperate attempt to find a safe haven amidst the chaos. Unleashing a final check, black's king hunts continue as the rooks coordinate for a decisive blow against the exposed white monarch, seeking to exploit the created weaknesses. The monarch desperately seeks refuge, but the surrounding squares offer no safety as black's rooks orchestrate a deadly mating net. A desperate gambit aimed at disrupting the white king's sanctuary and creating chaos, forcing a reevaluation of the endgame's immediate trajectory. White's king now scurries to the safety of the corner, abandoning its central post and seeking refuge behind the pawn, a necessary retreat to evade the immediate threats posed by black's coordinated pieces. Unleashing a final threat, the queen now aims to exploit the exposed white king through a devastating diagonal assault. A desperado tactic, forcing a series of exchanges that will lead to a decisive material advantage for white, leveraging the exposed black king and the pressure on the back rank. A desperate attempt to reignite counterplay by activating the king, but it walks into a decisive discovered attack. Guiding the rook across the board, white seeks to activate this piece on an open file, aiming to disrupt black's queen and potentially force a favorable exchange or create new tactical possibilities. The queen's recapture on d4 signals a dramatic shift, inviting an immediate endgame where white's pass d. Pawn is the primary objective, but black's remaining pieces, particularly the knight on d4, possess surprising attacking potential against white's somewhat exposed king. A decisive king hunt begins as white forcefully exploits the exposed black monarch. The king, exposed and adrift after a desperate gamble, now faces the unforgiving judgment of the remaining pieces. The pawn on d7, now a mere step from promotion, exerts immense pressure, forcing black to dedicate all resources to its containment and severely limiting their active piece play. A desperate last resort, checking into a potentially superior endgame for white, a gamble to disrupt white's king's safety even for a moment. Confronting the opposition's pervasive infiltration, this maneuver forces an immediate decision regarding the fate of the exposed king, potentially leading to a decisive simplification or a perilous pawn push. Suddenly, the queen is exposed, a prime target for a swift rook capture. Seizing the moment, white advances the monarch to a safer square amidst the lingering queen pressure, aiming to secure the king's position before any further complications arise. The queen strategically repositions to a more active square, eyeing potential tactical incursions and offering an escape route should the situation on the king side become precarious.